911, what's your emergency? Oh God, oh God. The hippo, it's got Mark. It's got Mark. Send help to the Olifants River Lodge now. The hippo is, oh Jesus, there's so much blood. Sir, stay calm. Help is on the way. Is the victim still in danger? I can't even see him anymore. The water is red. The hippo it came out of nowhere. In the pristine wilderness of South Africa's Limpopo province, where the Olifants River winds through ancient African bushveld, what began as a routine morning inspection would become a nightmare that shattered an entire community's sense of safety forever. The golden sunrise of March 15th, 2023, painted the river in deceptively peaceful hues, but beneath those calm waters lurked a 3-ton killer that would claim the life of one of the lodge's most experienced guides. Mark Lautenbach was 47 years old, a veteran safari guide with over 2 decades of experience in the African bush. He had guided thousands of tourists through close encounters with lions, elephants, and yes, even hippos. He thought he knew every inch of the riverbank, every hiding spot, every danger zone. He had no idea that on this particular morning, his extensive knowledge would fail him in the most catastrophic way possible. This is Mark Lautenbach's story. A story of experience meeting unpredictability, of a man who loved the wild, and the moment when that wild turned on him with prehistoric fury. What you're about to witness isn't just another animal attack. It's a stark reminder that in nature's domain, 20 years of experience can be erased in 20 seconds of primal violence. You're watching Wildlife Tragedies Unveiled, where we bring you the most shocking real-life animal encounters from around the globe. If the story grips you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because what you're about to witness will change how you see these seemingly docile river giants forever. This isn't just about one man's tragic end. It's about understanding why hippos kill more humans in Africa than any other large animal, and why even the most experienced guides can fall victim to their crushing jaws. Mark's final morning began like thousands before it. He woke at 4:45 a.m., kissed his wife Sarah goodbye, and grabbed his coffee, black, no sugar, the same way he'd drunk it for 20 years. The lodge was still quiet, guests still sleeping off the previous night's boma dinner. Mark liked this time of morning, when the bush belonged only to him and the awakening wildlife. He had no idea he was walking toward his final sunrise. The Olifants River Lodge wasn't just Mark's workplace. It was his home, his passion, his life's dedication. Nestled on the banks of the Olifants River, the lodge offered guests unparalleled views of hippos, crocodiles, and elephants coming to drink. Mark had been instrumental in developing the lodge's river walk, a carefully planned pathway that allowed guests to observe hippos safely from elevated positions. He knew every pod, every territorial bull, every mother with calves. Or at least he thought he did. Mark Lautenbach wasn't just another safari guide working the tourist circuit in South Africa. He was a legend among the Limpopo province guides. The man other guides called when they needed advice about animal behavior, the one lodge owners trusted with their most high-profile guests. Born in 1976 in Johannesburg, Mark grew up in the concrete jungle but always felt the call of the real one. His childhood bedroom walls weren't covered with soccer posters or rock bands, they were plastered with National Geographic photos of African wildlife, especially the Big Five. His passion for wildlife began during a family vacation to Kruger National Park when he was just 8 years old. While other kids complained about the early morning game drives, young Mark sat transfixed in the back of the safari vehicle, binoculars glued to his eyes, notebook in hand, documenting every sighting. His guide on that trip, an old Shangan tracker named Solomon, noticed the boy's enthusiasm and took him under his wing for the week. Solomon taught Mark how to read animal tracks in the sand, how to identify birds by their calls, and most importantly, how respect the wild. The bush will teach you everything, Solomon had said, but first you must learn to listen. Those words would guide Mark's entire career, though they would prove tragically insufficient on his final morning. Mark's parents, David and Helen Lautenbach, were both accountants who couldn't understand their son's obsession with wildlife. him toward a sensible career, and Mark dutifully enrolled in the University of Witwatersrand to study commerce. He lasted exactly 1 semester. The day he dropped out, his father refused to speak to him for 3 months. His mother cried. But Mark knew that spreadsheets and board meetings would kill his soul faster than any lion could kill his body. He packed his few belongings and headed north to Limpopo, determined to become the guide that Solomon had inspired him to be. Starting as an unpaid volunteer at a small reserve, Mark worked 18-hour days, learning everything from vehicle maintenance to wildlife photography. He slept in a tent that leaked during the rains, lived on pap and tinned beans, and loved every minute of it. His colleagues remember him as the eager kid who asked 1,000 questions and wrote everything down in a series of journals he would maintain throughout his career. By the time he was 25, Mark had earned his Level 3 field guide qualification and was leading walks with Dangerous Game, the highest and most prestigious guiding qualification in South Africa. Sarah met Mark in 2003 when she arrived at a lodge as a guest from England. She was a pediatric nurse on holiday, trying to forget a messy divorce. Mark was her guide for a walking safari, and she was terrified. "I thought he was absolutely mad," Sarah would later recall, "taking us so close to elephants and buffalo. But he had this calm confidence that made you feel safe. He'd point out a tiny bird or explain how ants communicate, and suddenly you realize the bush wasn't just about the big animals. He made it all come alive." Their romance bloomed under African stars, and Sarah never returned to England. They married 2 years later in a simple ceremony on the banks of the Olifants River, the same stretch of water where Mark would meet his end 18 years later. Together, Mark and Sarah built a life in the bush. They had 2 children, Emma, now 15, who inherited her father's love of wildlife, and James, 12, who preferred computers to campfires but adored his father's stories. Mark was the kind of father who turned every family outing into an educational adventure. He taught his children to identify animals by their droppings, to recognize alarm calls, to move silently through the bush. Emma often joined him on safer game drives during school holidays, and Mark dreamed of the day she would become a guide too. The Lautenbach legacy, he'd joke, though there was serious pride in his voice. Friends describe Mark as someone who could find humor in any situation but never at the expense of safety. Craig Morrison, who guided alongside Mark for 15 years, recalls Mark's infectious laugh and his ability to calm nervous guests. He had this way of explaining animal behavior that made sense to everyone, from PhD researchers to kids on their first safari. He'd say things like, "Think of a hippo as a bouncer at nightclub. They're not looking for trouble, but if you disrespect their space, you're going to have a bad time." The irony of this comparison would haunt Craig after Mark's death. But it was Mark's respect for wildlife that truly set him apart. He never anthropomorphized animals or treated them as pets. He understood that wild animals were unpredictable, dangerous, and deserving of space. He was known for canceling activities if he felt the animals were stressed or if conditions weren't right. "A good photo isn't worth a life," he'd tell disappointed guests, "neither mine nor the animals." He had reported other guides who got too close to animals for the sake of tips, earning him some enemies but more respect. Mark's expertise was particularly deep when it came to hippos. He had written articles for wildlife magazines about hippo behavior, consulted for documentary crews, and even helped relocate problem hippos to safer areas. He knew that despite their comical appearance, hippos were Africa's deadliest large mammal, responsible for more human deaths than lions, leopards, and elephants combined. He respected their territorial nature, their surprising speed both in water and on land, and their bone-crushing bite force of 1,800 pounds per square inch. People see them as fat, lazy river horses, Mark would tell his guests, but they're actually incredibly athletic, aggressive, and smart. Never, ever underestimate a hippo. Yet those who knew Mark best would later say that his confidence, built on 2 decades of successful encounters, might have become his weakness. His wife Sarah noticed subtle changes in his behavior over the last year. He'd been guiding for so long, everything had become routine, she reflected. He'd still preach safety to guests and new guides, but I'd sometimes see him taking shortcuts he would have scolded others for. Not dangerous things, just comfortable things. Like he'd forgotten that the animals don't know he's been doing this for 20 years. Hippos are Africa's most deceptive killers. In the wild, these massive herbivores spend up to 16 hours a day submerged in rivers and lakes, emerging at night to graze on grass. Despite their docile appearance and vegetarian diet, hippos are incredibly territorial, aggressive, and equipped with tusks that can grow up to 20 inches long. They can run at speeds of 30 miles per hour on land, faster than most humans, can sprint, and their powerful jaws can snap a canoe in half with the same ease that we might break a toothpick. In South Africa alone, hippos are responsible for more human fatalities than all predators combined, killing an estimated 500 people across Africa each year. The hippo that would change Mark Lautenbach's life forever was known to the lodge staff as Bonaparte, a massive bull estimated to be around 25 years old and weighing close to 3 tons. Bonaparte had been a fixture of the Olifants River stretch near the lodge for at least 8 years. He got his name from his aggressive territorial behavior and his tendency to chase off younger bulls with a ferocity that reminded the guides of a military commander defending his empire. Bonaparte controlled a prime section of the river that included 3 sandy beaches perfect for sunbathing and a deep pool where females liked to gather with their calves. Mark first encountered Bonaparte in 2015, shortly after the bull had claimed this stretch of river as his territory. The meeting was memorable. Bonaparte had charged Mark's boat during a sunset cruise, surfacing suddenly just meters away with his massive jaws agape in a threat display. Mark had expertly maneuvered the boat to safety, but he never forgot the intensity in the hippo's small, pink-rimmed eyes. "That one's got an attitude," Mark had written in his journal that night. "Need to give him extra space. Definitely the boss of this section." For years, this mutual respect seemed to work. Mark knew Bonaparte's favorite spots, his routine, his moods. He thought he could read the hippo like a book. For nearly 8 years, Mark and Bonaparte maintained an uneasy truce. Mark would point out the massive bull to guests from safe vantage points, explaining hippo's social dynamics and territorial behavior. Bonaparte, for his part, seemed to tolerate the daily human activity as long as boats kept their distance and nobody approached his favored wallowing spots. The lodge had strict protocols about Bonaparte: no boats within 50 meters, no walking tours near his territory during daylight hours, and constant vigilance during the breeding season when his aggression peaked. But experts were starting to notice troubling changes in Bonaparte's behavior. Dr. Jennifer Kruger, a wildlife behaviorist who studied the Olifants River hippo population, had warned the lodge management just 2 months before the attack that Bonaparte was showing signs of increased aggression. Male hippos typically become more territorial as they age, especially if they feel their dominance being challenged, she had written. In her report, Bonaparte has been displaying unusual aggression toward vehicles and other hippos. He's also been spending more time out of the water during daylight hours, which could indicate stress or illness. I strongly recommend increasing the buffer zone around his territory. Mark had dismissed these concerns, not out of arrogance but from experience. He'd seen Bonaparte go through aggressive phases before, usually during the dry season when water levels dropped and hippos were forced into closer proximity. "He's just grumpy because of the heat," Mark told the lodge manager. "I've been watching him for 8 years. I know when he's truly dangerous and when he's just posturing." This assessment would prove to be the most fatal miscalculation of Mark's career. The warning signs had indeed been escalating. 3 weeks before the attack, Bonaparte had mock-charged a fishing boat that ventured too close to his pool, something he hadn't done in over 2 years. The terrified fishermen reported that the hippo had followed them for nearly 200 meters. Unusual persistence for a territorial display. A week later, ground staff found deep hippo tracks leading all the way up to the lodge's fence line. indicating Bonaparte had been grazing much closer to human habitation than ever before. Most concerning was a report from a night guard who claimed to have seen Bonaparte fighting viciously with another bull, a battle so intense it had left blood in the water and deep gashes on both animals. Still, Mark rationalized each incident. The fishermen had been using illegal nets that could have entangled the hippo. The tracks near the lodge were probably from a different hippo, as Bonaparte rarely left the water during full moon periods. The fight with another bull was natural. Dominance behavior, nothing abnormal for the breeding season. Mark's 20 years of experience had taught him that hippos, while dangerous, were predictable if you understood their patterns. What he failed to recognize was that Bonaparte's patterns were changing. The lodge's junior guides had started expressing concerns about Bonaparte to each other, though few dared to question Mark's judgment directly. Tommy Ndlovu, who had been guiding for just 2 years, later recalled feeling uneasy about Bonaparte in the weeks leading up to the attack. The old bull would watch us differently, Tommy said. Before, he'd glance at the boats and go back to resting. But recently he'd track us with his eyes. The entire time. His ears would twitch constantly, and he'd position himself facing us, not sideways like usual. In guide training, they teach you. Those are pre-charge indicators. But Mark said Bonaparte was just being theatrical. The situation was further complicated by environmental factors. The summer of 2023 had been unusually hot and dry, with water levels in the Olifants River dropping to near-record lows. This concentrated the hippo population into smaller pools, increasing competition and stress. Food was also becoming scarce as the drought killed off grass along the riverbanks, forcing hippos to travel further inland to graze and bringing them into more frequent contact with humans. Bonaparte's pool, once spacious enough to accommodate him and several females comfortably, had shrunk to half its normal size. Dr. Kruger returned to the lodge on March 10, just 5 days before the attack, to conduct a follow-up assessment. Her findings were alarming. Bonaparte is displaying all the classic signs of a hippo under severe stress, she noted. Increased yawning, spraying dung more frequently and, most concerning, he's been observed grazing during daylight hours. This is highly abnormal and suggests he's not getting enough food at night. Stressed hippos are exponentially more dangerous. I cannot emphasize enough the need for extreme caution around this animal. Mark attended the briefing where Dr. Kruger presented her findings. Witnesses recall him listening politely but ultimately disagreeing with her assessment. With respect, Doc, Mark had said, I've been watching this river every day for 8 years. You visit once a month. Bonaparte's just adapting to the dry conditions like all the other wildlife. We've had droughts before, and he's been fine. I'm not going to panic the guests or change our entire operation based on a hippo being grumpy about his shrinking pool. Several guides noticed Dr. Kruger's frustrated expression, but Mark's seniority and reputation made his word final. The final warning came just 2 days before the attack. A couple staying at the lodge reported that during their morning coffee on their deck, overlooking the river, they had seen Bonaparte charge at a crocodile that had ventured too close to his resting spot. This was highly unusual. Hippos and crocodiles typically maintain a respectful coexistence. The violence of the charge had sent the 4-meter crocodile scrambling up the bank in a panic. The couple had filmed the incident, and the footage showed Bonaparte pursuing the crocodile onto land for several meters before returning to the water. When shown the video, Mark had laughed it off. Bonaparte's just showing the croc who's boss. Can't say I blame him. That croc's been getting too comfortable in his territory. On the evening of March 14th, the night before his death, Mark led his final sunset cruise. Guests on that cruise later recalled it as magical. Elephants crossing the river, fish eagles calling, and yes, Bonaparte wallowing peacefully in his pool. Mark had pointed out the big bull with his usual enthusiasm, regaling guests with stories of hippo behavior and Bonaparte's personality. Nobody could have imagined that in less than 12 hours, the guide they trusted with their lives would lose his own to the very animal he thought he knew so well. In the 48 hours leading up to March 15th, The signs were mounting like storm clouds on the horizon, yet Mark Lautenbach continued to interpret them through the lens of his 20 years of experience rather than the reality unfolding before him. The morning of March 13th had brought an incident that should have served as a final warning. Junior guide Tommy Ndlovu had taken the dawn photography tour to the bird hide overlooking Bonaparte's pool when the massive bull suddenly erupted from the water, bellowing and thrashing in what appeared to be an unprovoked rage. The guests, initially thrilled by the display, quickly became frightened as Bonaparte fixed his gaze on the hide and began moving toward the bank. Tommy immediately evacuated the hide, later reporting that he'd never seen such aggressive behavior without a clear trigger. When Mark reviewed the incident report that afternoon, he found a rational explanation. "Check the tide tables," he told Tommy, pulling up data on his computer. "Full moon 2 nights ago, which means the fish are running upstream. Bonaparte hates it when the tiger fish spawn in his pool. They nip at the hippo's skin. He wasn't threatening you, he was pissed off at the fish." Tommy wanted to point out that Bonaparte had been staring directly at the hide, not at any fish, but challenging Mark's expertise felt like questioning gravity itself. The incident was logged as territorial display due to fish activity and filed away. Dr. Jennifer Kruger made one final attempt to intervene on March 13th, calling Mark directly after hearing about the morning's events from Tommy. Their conversation, which Mark's wife Sarah overheard from the next room, would later haunt everyone who learned of it. "Mark, I'm not trying to undermine your experience," Dr. Kruger had said, her voice tight with frustration over the speakerphone. "But Bonaparte is displaying textbook pre-attack behavior. The daylight grazing, the increased aggression, the expansion of his territorial displays, these aren't normal seasonal variations. Something is seriously wrong with that animal." Mark's response was measured but firm. "Jennifer, I appreciate your concern, I really do. But I've seen Bonaparte through 8 dry seasons. Gets cranky when his pool shrinks, more vocal when the females are in estrus, and yes, he's been pushing boundaries lately. But that's what dominant bulls do. They test, they display, they maintain their status. If we evacuated every time a hippo yawned aggressively, we'd never run a single tour." There was a pause before Dr. Kruger replied, "Mark, this isn't about yawning. This is about an animal whose behavior has fundamentally changed. Promise me you'll at least increase the safety protocols around his territory." Mark had promised, but Sarah noticed he made no notes, sent no emails, changed no schedules. The lodge's other senior guide, Craig Morrison, was growing increasingly concerned about his friend's dismissive attitude. On the evening of March 13th, he found Mark updating the next day's activity schedule in the lodge office. Maybe we should reroute the morning river walk?" Craig suggested carefully. "Take them upstream instead, away from Bonaparte's stretch." Mark looked up from his computer, a slight smile on his weathered face. "Craig, you've been listening to too much doom and gloom from the doc. Bonaparte's a grumpy old man, not a serial killer. Besides, the guests specifically requested to see the big hippo pool. That's what they're paying for." Craig persisted, something gnawing at his gut. "I was down there this afternoon, checking the pathway. Found fresh hippo tracks on the main trail. The one we use for the walking tours. Massive prints, had to be Bonaparte. He's been coming up much higher than usual." Mark's response would later torment Craig with its casual confidence. "Hippos graze, Craig. They have to eat somewhere. He's probably just found a nice patch of grass up there. Look, I'll personally check the area before we take any guests through. 20 years, remember? I haven't lost a guest yet, and I'm not planning to start now." Neighbors at the staff village reported that Mark seemed unusually tired on the evening of March 13th. He'd been pulling double shifts to cover for a guide who was on sick leave, leading both dawn and dusk activities for 5 days straight. Sarah later revealed that he'd been suffering from insomnia, often waking at 2 or 3 a.m. and unable to fall back asleep. He said his mind was racing with lodge business, tourist schedules, staff issues, she recalled. But looking back, I wonder if some part of him sensed something was wrong. He kept checking the window that overlooked the river, even in the middle of the night. Mark's behavior on March 14th, his last full day alive, struck several people as oddly nostalgic. He spent extra time with the junior guides, sharing stories and teaching techniques he'd normally consider too advanced for their experience level. He called his daughter Emma at school during lunch, something he rarely did, just to tell her he loved her and was proud of her recent biology test results. That evening he sat with Sarah on their porch for nearly an hour after dinner, holding her hand and watching the sunset paint the river gold. He told me about the first time he saw the Olifants River. Sarah remembered through tears how he knew instantly that this was where he belonged. He said he couldn't imagine doing anything else, being anywhere else. The final sunset cruise on March 14th was, by all accounts, spectacular. Mark was in his element, his enthusiasm infectious as he guided the boat past pods of hippos, pointing out behaviors and family dynamics with the expertise that made him legendary. When they reached Bonaparte's pool, the massive bull was in full display mode, yawning widely to show his impressive tusks. "Look at that magnificence," Mark told his guests, his voice filled with genuine awe. 3 tons of evolutionary perfection. Hippos have remained virtually unchanged for millions of years because they don't need to be anything else. They're perfect just as they are. A guest named Hans Müller from Germany was filming the encounter and later provided investigators with footage that showed something unsettling. While Mark was explaining hippo behavior to the other guests, Bonaparte never took his eyes off the guide. The hippo's ears were pinned back, his nostrils flared, and he held his body in an unusual vertical position in the water. Hans, an amateur wildlife photographer, mentioned to his wife that the hippo seemed intensely focused on Mark specifically, not the boat in general. When they'd mentioned this observation to Mark after returning to the lodge, he'd laughed. "Bonaparte and I go way back. He's probably just wondering why I haven't brought him any watermelons lately." That night, the lodge's night guard, Samson Gunny, witnessed something that he didn't report until after the tragedy. Around 3 a.m. he saw Bonaparte completely out of the water, standing on the riverbank directly below the staff quarters. The hippo stood there for nearly 10 minutes, absolutely still, facing the buildings. "It was like he was watching something," Samson later said, "or waiting. I've worked here 6 years and I've never seen him come that far up, especially just to stand there. It gave me cold fear, but I thought maybe he was just grazing and I couldn't see the grass in the dark." The morning of March 15th dawned clear and crisp, with a light mist hanging over the river that would burn off within an hour. Mark woke at his usual 4:45 a.m., but Sarah noticed he seemed distracted during their brief morning coffee together. He kept looking out the window toward the river, she recalled. "I asked if everything was okay and he said yes, but then added something strange. He said, maybe I should take Craig's advice about changing the walk route." I was surprised because he'd been so adamant the night before. But then he shook his head and said, "No, I'm being silly. Bonaparte's just an old hippo doing hippo things." The last person to speak with Mark before the incident was Precious, the lodge's head chef, who handed him a packed breakfast for the morning. Mr. Mark seemed happy, joking like always, she remembered. "He told me my rusks were so hard they could crack a hippo's tooth." Then he said something that didn't seem strange then but does now. He said, "Precious, if anything ever happens to me, make sure Sarah knows the password to my computer. All the guide training materials are on there." I said, "Don't talk nonsense, Mr. Mark." He just smiled and took his coffee. As Mark prepared his gear for the morning river walk, checking his radio, binoculars, and first aid kit, Bonaparte was already on the move. Unknown to anyone, the massive bull had left his pool before dawn and made his way upstream, crossing into territory he rarely visited. Camera, trapped near the staff quarters, checked only after the incident, captured a chilling image: Bonaparte at 5:23 a.m., completely out of the water, standing in the exact spot where Mark would lead his tour group just 2 hours later. The hippo's posture in the photo was unusual, tense, alert, his massive head lifted as if scenting the air. The tour group that morning consisted of 6 guests, the Mueller couple from Germany, 2 sisters from Australia celebrating a 60th birthday, and a honeymooning couple from Japan. They gathered at the lodge reception at 6:30 a.m., excited about the walking safari that promised close encounters with nature. Mark arrived punctual as always, dressed in his khaki uniform with the lodge logo, his weathered bush hat shadowing his. Hans Mueller later recalled that Mark seemed completely normal, professional, making jokes to calm the nervous guests. There was no indication that within an hour, their experienced guide would make a fatal miscalculation that would cost him his life. Wednesday, March 15, 6:45 a.m. The morning mist still clung to the Olifants River as Mark Lautenbach led his group down the wooden steps from the lodge toward the riverside trail. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of the river and the sweet fragrance of flowering acacias. Mark paused at the bottom of the steps, as he always did, to brief his guests one final time. Remember, single file behind me, no sudden movements, and if I raise my hand, you freeze immediately. The animals here are wild and unpredictable, but if we respect their space, we'll have an incredible experience. The guests nodded eagerly, adjusting their cameras and binoculars, completely trusting the man who would unknowingly lead them into a nightmare. The walking route was one Mark had traversed hundreds of times, a well-worn path that wound along the riverbank for about 2 kilometers, offering spectacular views of the water and frequent wildlife sightings. At 6:50 a.m., the group set off, Mark leading with his practiced, nearly silent bushman's walk. Behind him, the Mueller couple tried to match his quiet steps, followed by the Australian sisters who whispered excitedly to each other about the hippo sightings they hoped for. The Japanese honeymooners brought up the rear, the husband helping his wife navigate the occasionally rough terrain. Bonaparte was already in position, though no one knew it yet. The massive bull had chosen his ambush site with an intelligence that would later shock wildlife experts. He had positioned himself in a reed bed approximately 300 meters from his usual pool, in an area where the path curved close to the water's edge. This spot was particularly dangerous because the thick reeds obscured the view of the water, and the curve in the path meant Mark wouldn't see the danger until he was almost on top of it. The hippo had been there since before dawn, waiting with a patience that suggested not random aggression, but calculated intent. At 6:55 a.m., Mark stopped the group to point out a pair of fish eagles perched in a dead tree across the river. "Those are our African fish eagles," he explained, his voice low but clear. "Mated pairs like this one can stay together for life, sometimes over 20 years. As he spoke on, Mueller noticed something that didn't register as significant until later. Mark kept glancing toward the section of path ahead, the area where it curved toward the water. It was like he was expecting something, Hans would later tell investigators. Not worried exactly, just aware. The group moved on, Mark pointing out tracks in the sandy soil, warthog, waterbuck, and yes, hippo. The hippo tracks were fresh, probably from the previous night, and Mark knelt to show the guests the distinctive four-toed print. "See how deep these are? That tells you this is a big animal, probably over 2 tons. Hippos look clumsy, but they're actually walking on their tiptoes. These prints are from them heading to graze inland." The Australian sister, Helen, asked if the tracks could be from Bonaparte. Mark studied them more carefully, his brow furrowing slightly. "Could be," he admitted. "These are definitely from a large bull. But hippos usually return to water before dawn. He's probably back in his pool by now." At 7:02 a.m., they reached a section where the path split, one route staying high on the bank, the other dropping closer to the water's edge. Was the decision point Craig Morrison had mentioned, where Mark could have taken the safer, elevated route. For a moment, Mark paused, considering. The Japanese woman, Yuki, later recalled that Mark seemed to have a brief internal debate. He looked at both paths, then at us, then back at the paths. Finally, he smiled and said, The lower path has better views. Just stay close and watch where I point. This decision would place them directly in Bonaparte's strike zone. As they descended toward the lower path, the world seemed to hold its breath. The usual morning chorus of birds fell silent, a phenomenon Bushmen call the quiet before death. Mark noticed it immediately, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung over his shoulder. He stopped the group with a raised hand, his senses on high alert. Something spooked the birds, he whispered. Could be a leopard, could be nothing. Give me a moment. He scanned the surrounding bush, looking up into trees for leopards, checking the path ahead for buffalo or elephant signs. But he was looking in the wrong places. The danger wasn't in the bush or the trees, it was in the water, hidden behind a screen of reeds just 20 meters ahead. At 7:05 a.m., Mark made the decision to continue. The silence was unsettling, but he'd experienced false alarms before. Sometimes birds went quiet when eagles flew over, or when baboons moved through the canopy. He motioned for the group to follow, but his pace was noticeably more cautious. Helen, the Australian, whispered to her sister, "This is so exciting, like being in a nature documentary." She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, though the documentary would be a tragedy, not an adventure. Bonaparte remained perfectly still in his reed bed, only his eyes and nostrils visible above the waterline. Hippos can hold their breath for up to 5 minutes, and Bonaparte was using this ability to remain virtually invisible. What made his position particularly deadly was that he had chosen a spot where the riverbank was steep and muddy. If someone needed to retreat quickly, they would likely slip or stumble. Whether this was intentional or coincidental would be debated by animal behaviorists for months afterward. At 7:08 a.m., the group reached the curve in the path. Mark was now in full alert mode, his movements careful and deliberate. He held up his hand again, signaling the group to stop while he advanced a few steps to peer around the bend. This was standard procedure. Never lead guests blindly around corners where animals might be resting. What Mark couldn't see from his angle was that Bonaparte had positioned himself not around the curve, but perpendicular to it, hidden in the reeds that grew thick at the water's edge. The hippo's tactical positioning suggested a level of planning that would challenge everything experts thought they knew about hippo behavior. Hans Müller, filming from the back of the group, toured what happened next. At 7:09 a.m., his camera recorded Mark taking 3 more steps forward, his body language relaxed as he saw what appeared to be a clear path ahead. "All clear," Mark said, turning back to wave the group forward. "There's a beautiful view of the main pool just ahead." As he turned back toward the river, a massive explosion of water erupted from the ooze. Bonaparte launched himself from his hiding spot with a speed that defied his massive bulk, covering the distance between the water and the path in less than 2 seconds. The first sound was a thunderous bellow that seemed to shake the very ground. Mark's reflexes, honed by 20 years in the bush, kicked in. Immediately, he shouted, "Hippo! Back!" while simultaneously trying to unsling his rifle. But Bonaparte had chosen his moment perfectly. The distance was too short, the attack too sudden. The massive bull's jaws, capable of exerting 1,800 pounds of pressure per square inch, were already opening as he cleared the riverbank. In that frozen moment, captured forever on Hans Müller's camera, several things happened simultaneously. Mark managed to push the nearest guest, Helen, backward with his left hand while his right hand freed his rifle. The other guests, trained by Mark's earlier briefing, began retreating immediately. But Mark himself had no time to escape. He made a split-second decision that defined his character. Instead of trying to save himself, he stepped forward, placing himself between the charging hippo and his guests. Bonaparte's first contact was not a bite but a crushing body slam. 3 tons of muscle and bone moving at nearly 20 miles per hour struck Mark with the force of a small car. The impact lifted the guide off his feet and sent him flying backward into a thorn bush. The rifle flew from his hands, landing uselessly in the mud 10 feet away. Bonaparte's momentum carried him past Mark's position, but the hippo displayed an agility that belied his size, spinning around with terrifying speed to face his target again. Mark, despite being wounded and winded from the impact, tried to scramble to his feet. Blood was already streaming from multiple lacerations caused by the thorns and the initial impact. His training kicked in. He knew that staying down meant death. "Run!" he screamed at his guests, who were frozen in horror. "Get to high ground now." The authority in his voice, even in extremis, broke their paralysis. The group began. Scrambling up the bank, Hans Müller still filming, unable to process what he was recording. Bonaparte charged again, and this time there would be no escape. Mark had managed to get to his knees but couldn't regain his footing on the muddy slope. The hippo's massive jaws opened to their full extent, nearly 150 degrees, revealing tusks that gleamed like yellowed sabers in the morning light. Mark raised his arms instinctively, a futile gesture against such overwhelming force. The last clear image on Müller's video showed Mark's face, not twisted in fear, but set in determination, still trying to position himself to protect his fleeing guests. Then Bonaparte's jaws closed with a sound that would haunt every witness for the rest of their lives. The sound of Bonaparte's jaws closing on Mark Lautenbach was unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard or would ever forget, a sickening combination of crushing bone and tearing flesh that seemed to echo across the river valley. The massive hippo had caught Mark around the torso, his lower canines puncturing through the guide's back while the upper tusks drove deep into his chest and abdomen. Mark's scream, primal and agonizing, cut through the morning air before being abruptly choked off as Bonaparte's bite compressed his lungs. Hans Müller's camera, still recording despite his horror, captured the brutal reality of what a hippo attack truly entails. Bonaparte didn't simply bite once and release. Instead, the 3-ton bull shook Mark like a terrier with a rat, the guide's body going limp as ragdoll physics took over. Blood sprayed in arterial spurts, painting the sandy riverbank in horrifying crimson patterns. The Australian sisters were screaming, scrambling up the bank, Helen slipping in the mud and frantically crawling on all fours to escape. The Japanese couple stood frozen in shock until Yuki's husband grabbed her and physically dragged her away from the scene. Mark, impossibly, was still conscious. Even with catastrophic injuries, his body's adrenaline response kept him aware of the horror unfolding. He managed to get one hand free and was weakly striking at Bonaparte's massive head, his fist bouncing uselessly off the hippo's 2-inch thick skin. His legs kicked spasmodically, whether from conscious effort or nerve damage, no one could tell. Bonaparte adjusted his grip, releasing momentarily only to bite down again, this time catching Mark's right shoulder and upper chest. The crunch of Mark's shoulder blade shattering was audible even over the chaos. "Oh God, he's eating him! He's eating him!" Helen screamed, her voice breaking with hysteria. But Bonaparte wasn't eating Mark. This was something far more primal and terrifying. This was territorial aggression taken to its most extreme form. Dr. Jennifer Kruger would later explain that hippos don't prey on humans, they destroy them as threats. And Bonaparte was being extraordinarily thorough in eliminating what he perceived as a threat to his domain. The attack had now lasted approximately 30 seconds, though witnesses would swear it felt like hours. Bonaparte dragged Mark toward the water, the guide's boots leaving deep furrows in the mud as he was pulled inexorably toward the river. This behavior puzzled experts. Typically, hippos attack on land and then return to water alone. But Bonaparte seemed intent on taking his victim with him, perhaps to ensure the threat was completely eliminated. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the air. Samson Gunny, the night guard who was just ending his shift, had heard the screams and come running with his rifle. His first shot hit the water near Bonaparte, startling the hippo enough to make him pause. Mark used this momentary distraction to attempt one last desperate escape. Despite injuries that would have killed most people instantly, he managed to roll partially free of Bonaparte's jaws, landing face down in the shallow water at the river's edge. But Bonaparte's rage was far from spent. The massive bull pivoted with surprising grace and brought one of his front feet down on Mark's lower back with crushing force. Hippos kill more people with trampling than with bites, and Bonaparte's foot, supporting nearly a ton of weight, drove Mark deeper into the mud. The guide's fingers clawed desperately at the riverbank, trying to pull himself to safety, leaving bloody handprints on the rocks that would remain visible for days afterward. Hans Mueller, still filming despite tears streaming down his face, captured Mark's face in profile during this moment. His expression was one of profound surprise more than fear, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening to him after 20 years of safe encounters. Blood bubbled from his mouth as he tried to speak, though his words were lost in the gurgling. Some witnesses later claimed he was trying to shout more warnings to his guests, still thinking of their safety even as his life ebbed away. Samson fired again, this shot striking Bonaparte in the thick hide of his rump. The bullet from the lodge's .375 rifle barely penetrated the hippo's skin but succeeded in causing pain. Bonaparte bellowed in rage and confusion, momentarily lifting his foot from Mark's back. The guide attempted to crawl forward, managing to move perhaps a meter before his strength failed. He collapsed face-first into the mud, his body convulsing as it went into shock from massive blood loss and trauma. Bonaparte turned his attention to this new threat, his small eyes focusing on Samson with terrifying intensity. The guard stood his ground, chambering another round, knowing that if the hippo charged him, he'd have one shot at best. The distance between them was less than 30 meters, a distance Bonaparte could cover in under 4 seconds. For a moment that stretched like eternity, man and beast stared at each other across the blood-stained riverbank. Then Bonaparte made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of charging Samson or continuing his attack on Mark, the massive bull turned and crashed back into the river. But he didn't flee immediately. Instead, he surfaced in the deeper water and turned to face the shore as if guarding his territory from any who might dare approach. His eyes never left the spot where Mark lay motionless, half in and half out of the water. The Japanese husband, Takashi, was the first to overcome his shock enough to act. Despite his wife's terrified protests, he began sliding down the bank toward Mark. "We have to help him," he shouted in accented English. Hans Mueller joined him, handing his camera to his sobbing wife. Together, they reached Mark's prone form, immediately recoiling at the extent of his injuries. Mark's khaki uniform was shredded, revealing wounds that made both men fight not to vomit. His back looked like it had been run through an industrial press, and the bite wounds were so deep that internal organs were visible. Miraculously, horrifyingly, Mark was still breathing. Ragged, wet gasps that brought pink foam to his lips with each exhalation. His eyes were open, but unfocused, staring at something beyond the physical world. Takashi, who had basic first aid training, knew immediately that these injuries were far beyond any field treatment. The kindest thing would be to make Mark comfortable in his final moments, but even that seemed impossible given the severity of his wounds. Mark, can you hear me?" Hans shouted, gently touching the guide's shoulder, one of the few parts of his body that seemed relatively undamaged. Mark's eyes flickered, seeming to focus momentarily on Hans's face. His lips moved, forming words without sound. Hans leaned closer, trying to hear, and later swore that Mark whispered, "Tell Sarah?" Before his eyes rolled back and his breathing became even more labored. Bonaparte remained in the water throughout this, watching. Several times he moved closer to shore, causing the would-be rescuers to scramble back in terror. The hippo's behavior was unprecedented. Having delivered what should have been a killing attack, he seemed determined to ensure his victim couldn't be saved. Dr. Kruger would later theorize that this represented a level of territorial aggression rarely seen in wildlife, suggesting that Bonaparte saw Mark not just as a momentary threat, but as a rival to be eliminated completely. Samson maintained his position on the bank, rifle trained on Bonaparte, shouting for the guests to stay back. He had radioed for help, his voice cracking as he reported, "Code red at River Path Section 3. Guide down." Hippo attack. We need medical and backup now. The radio crackled. With confused responses, in 20 years of operation, the lodge had never had a code red. Some staff members initially thought it was a drill. Helen, the Australian woman Mark had pushed to safety in the attack's first seconds, was in hysterics. He saved me, she kept repeating. Pushed me away and took my place. Oh God, he took my place. Her sister held her, both women shaking uncontrollably as they watched the nightmare unfolding below. The image of Mark, their cheerful, confident guide from just minutes ago, now broken and dying in the mud, was a horror that would require years of therapy to process. 5 minutes had passed since the initial attack, though it felt like a lifetime. Mark's breathing had become increasingly erratic, long pauses between each labored gasp. Blood loss was massive. The sand around him had turned into a dark red mud. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, visible even from a distance. Takashi and Hans had tried to apply pressure to the worst wounds, but there were simply too many, too severe. Hands and clothes were soaked with blood, and they were both fighting shock themselves. Then, with a final shuddering breath that lifted his entire body slightly off the ground, Mark Lautenbach's 20-year career as a safari guide came to an end. His body relaxed, settling into the mud with a finality that needed no medical confirmation. The silence that followed was broken only by the lapping of water against the shore and Helen's inconsolable sobbing. Even Bonaparte seemed to sense the change, his aggressive posturing relaxing slightly as he continued to watch from the water. The witnesses stood in stunned silence, processing the reality that they had just watched a man die in one of the most violent ways imaginable. Hans Müller lowered his camera, finally realizing he had recorded the entire attack. The weight of that footage, evidence of Mark's heroic last acts and horrible death, would burden him for years to come. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard, but everyone knew it was far too late. The sound of racing vehicles grew louder as the lodge's emergency response team careened down the dirt track toward River Path Section 3. The lead Toyota Land Cruiser, driven by head ranger Craig Morrison, nearly went airborne over a termite mound in his desperate rush to reach his friend. Behind him, 2 more vehicles carried the medical team, additional rangers, and the lodge manager. The radio chatter was frantic and confused. Sampson's initial report had been so unprecedented that many staff members were still trying to process what was happening. At 7:18 a.m., just 12 minutes after Bonaparte's initial charge, the first vehicle skidded to a stop at the top of the riverbank. Craig leaped out before the engine had fully died, his rifle already in his hands as he surveyed the scene below. What he saw made him freeze momentarily in part. His friend and colleague of 15 years lay motionless in the blood-soaked mud, clearly beyond any medical intervention. The traumatized guests huddled on the bank, some crying, others in visible shock. And there in the river, Bonaparte still maintained his vigil, as if ensuring his defeated rival wouldn't rise again. Medical team, hold position. Craig barked, his training overriding his emotional turmoil. We still have an active threat in the water. Dr. Susan Reeves, the lodge's resident physician, arrived moments later with her emergency kit, but one look at Mark's condition told her everything she needed to know. She'd seen trauma in her years of emergency medicine, but the sheer violence of Mark's injuries was beyond anything in her experience. Nevertheless, she insisted on going down to officially confirm what everyone already knew. Wildlife Control Officer Thabo Mthembu arrived in the second vehicle, carrying the specialized equipment used for dangerous animal situations. It immediately began assessing Bonaparte's position and behavior. The hippo had moved slightly deeper into the water but remained focused on the shore, occasionally opening his massive jaws in a threat display. He's still in full territorial mode, Thabo reported to Craig. If anyone goes near that body, he'll charge again. The immediate priority became twofold: securing the scene to recover Mark's body and ensuring the traumatized guests received medical attention. Dr. Reeves, accompanied by 2 armed rangers, carefully made her way down to where Takashi and Hans still knelt beside Mark. Two men were in shock, covered in blood, their hands still futilely pressed against wounds that no longer bled. "You did everything you could, sir," Reeves told them gently, checking Mark's carotid artery as a formality. At 7:23 a.m., she officially pronounced Mark Lautenbach dead at the scene. Getting the guests to safety proved challenging. Helen was in a complete hysteric breakdown, requiring sedation before she could be moved. Her sister Margaret wasn't much better, vomiting repeatedly from the stress and horror. Yuki, the Japanese bride, had gone into a dissociative state, responding to nothing and no one, her new husband frantically trying to comfort her. Hans Müller sat on a rock, staring at his blood-covered hands, the camera hanging around his neck like an albatross of tragic evidence. The medical team worked efficiently despite the chaos. Two nurses began treating the guests for shock, wrapping them in thermal blankets and administering mild sedatives where necessary. The physical injuries were minimal, scratches and bruises from the panicked retreat up the bank. But the psychological trauma was severe. Dr. Reeves established a triage area on the flat ground above the bank, turning the scene into something resembling a field hospital. Meanwhile, Bonaparte presented a unique challenge. The hippo showed no signs of leaving the area, and his presence made recovering Mark's body impossible. Tabo made several attempts to encourage the bull to move, using vehicles to create noise and disturbance, but Bonaparte merely submerged partially and held his position. "He's claimed this as a kill site," Tabo explained to Craig. "In his mind, this is now part of his territory. He might stay here for hours, even days." The decision was made to call in additional wildlife authorities. The South African National Park's helicopter was dispatched from Skukuza, carrying a veterinarian with tranquilizer equipment powerful enough to sedate a bull hippo. But that would take at least an hour, during which time Mark's body would remain in the mud, a sight that tormented everyone present, especially Craig, who had to fight every instinct to retrieve his friend's remains. Lodge manager Peter van der Merwe arrived at 7:35 a.m., immediately taking control of the administrative chaos. The scene needed to be documented for the inevitable investigation, families needed to be notified, and the media situation had to be managed. Word was already spreading. Several guests at the lodge had seen the emergency vehicles racing out, and social media was beginning to buzz with speculation. Peter's first priority was containing the situation before misinformation spread. The police arrived at 7:42 a.m., led by Captain Joshua Mandela from the Hoedspruit station. He immediately declared the area a crime scene, not because a crime had been committed, but because any death involving wildlife required a full investigation. The officers began the grim task of photographing the scene, taking witness statements, and securing evidence. Hans Müller's camera footage would prove crucial, though viewing it was a task no one relished. Back at the lodge, Sarah Lautenbach was in the kitchen, discussing the lunch menu with staff, blissfully unaware that her life had just shattered. Peter van der Merwe and the lodge's human resources manager, Grace Moleff, drew the terrible duty of notification. They found Sarah laughing at something one of the chefs had said, her face bright with the simple joy of a normal morning. The moment she saw their expressions, the laughter died. "Where's Mark?" she asked, though somehow she already knew. The helicopter arrived at 8:45 a.m., circling the scene as the crew assessed the situation. Bonaparte looked up at the aircraft but maintained his position. Dr. André Ferry, the veterinarian, prepared his tranquilizer rifle with a dose calculated for a 3-ton hippo. The plan was to dart Bonaparte from the air, wait for sedation to take effect, then recover Mark's body while the hippo was unconscious. It was a delicate operation. Too little drug and Bonaparte might charge again. Too much could kill him. The first dart struck Bonaparte in the shoulder at 8:52 a.m. The hippo bellowed and submerged completely, causing momentary panic that he might escape downstream. But he surfaced moments later, the bright orange fletching of the dart visible against his dark hide. The ketamine and xylazine combination would take 15 to 20 minutes to fully sedate him. Those minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness as everyone Waited, Mark's body still visible in the mud below. During the wait, Craig noticed something that broke his composure completely. Mark's bush hat, the one he'd worn every day for years, had fallen near a cluster of reeds. It was unmarked by blood, sitting there as if Mark might walk over and pick it up at any moment. Craig had to turn away, struggling to maintain the professional demeanor his team needed from him in this crisis. At 9:08 a.m., Bonaparte's movements became sluggish. His massive head began to droop, and he moved into shallower water, fighting the sedation. With the instinct of a wild animal that knows unconsciousness means vulnerability, Dr. Ferry watched through binoculars, gauging the moment when it would be safe to approach. Another 5 minutes, he announced. He's going down but still has enough consciousness to be dangerous. Finally, at 9:14 a.m., Bonaparte succumbed to the drugs. The massive hippo settled onto a sandbar in the shallows, his breathing deep and regular. But his eyes closed. Tabo and his team immediately moved in with ropes and a specialized hippo stretcher. The plan was to move Bonaparte deeper water where he could recover safely without posing a threat to the recovery operation. It took 6 men and a vehicle winch to move the sedated giant, his dead weight making every meter a struggle. With Bonaparte secured, the recovery team could finally approach Mark. Craig insisted on being part of this detail, despite Peter's suggestion that he might want to remember his friend differently. "I owe him this," Craig said simply. The recovery was heartbreaking. Mark's injuries were even more severe than they'd appeared from a distance. The team worked in respectful silence, carefully placing his remains in a body bag and carrying him up the bank where an ambulance waited. As Mark's body was loaded into the ambulance, a remarkable thing happened. The lodge staff, who had gathered at the top of the bank, began singing a traditional Shangan funeral song. Their voices, rich with grief and respect, carried across the river valley. Even the police officers removed their caps, and several of the rangers who had worked with Mark for years openly wept. It was a spontaneous tribute to a man who had been not just a colleague but a mentor, friend, and integral part of their community. The scene processing continued for hours. Every piece of evidence was photographed and catalogued. The exact path of Mark's final walk was. Bonaparte's tracks were cast in plaster. Witness statements were taken and retaken, though the guests were barely coherent. Helen required medical transport to the nearest hospital, her psychological state deteriorating rapidly. The others were sedated and would spend the night under observation at the lodge's medical facility. By noon, Bonaparte was showing signs of awakening. The veterinary team monitored him carefully as the sedatives wore off. Disoriented at first, then agitated as he realized he'd been moved. But something had changed. The hyper-aggressive territorial behavior was gone, replaced by what seemed like confusion. He swam slowly back toward his original pool, leaving the area where Mark had died without a backward glance. It was as if whatever demon had driven him to such extreme violence had been exorcised. The ambulance carrying Mark Lautenbach's body arrived at the Hodsprut Medical Center at 10:47 a.m., though there was nothing the medical staff could do except prepare the remains for the coroner's examination. Dr. Marianne Venter, the district coroner, would later describe Mark's injuries as among the most severe wildlife-inflicted trauma she had encountered in her 23-year career. The official autopsy report, completed 2 days later, catalogued injuries that painted a horrifying picture. Massive crush injuries to the torso, 27 individual puncture wounds from Bonaparte's tusks, severe spinal trauma, and catastrophic blood loss from severed arteries. The cause of death was listed as hypovolemic shock secondary to multiple traumatic injuries sustained in hippopotamus attack. Sarah Lautenbach sat in the lodge manager's office, still unable to fully process what she'd been told. Grace Moleff held her as she oscillated between denial and devastating grief. "He can't be gone," Sarah kept repeating. "We were supposed to take Emma to university next month. Promised to teach James to track this summer. He can't be gone." The worst moment came when she had to call their children at school, who idolized her father, became hysterical and had to be sedated by the school nurse. James, only 12, kept asking if it was a joke, unable to comprehend that his invincible father could be killed by an animal he'd safely observed hundreds of times. The investigation into the attack began immediately, led by Captain Mandela with assistance from provincial wildlife authorities. Every aspect of the incident was scrutinized, from the lodge's safety protocols to Mark's decision-making on that fatal morning. Hans Mueller's footage proved invaluable, though watching it was traumatic for investigators. The video clearly showed that Mark had followed standard procedures until the moment of ambush, and his final acts were heroic attempts to save his guests. There was no evidence of negligence or recklessness that often accompanies wildlife attacks. Bonaparte presented a more complex issue. The massive hippo had returned to his pool and resumed what appeared to be normal behavior. Wildlife authorities faced a difficult decision. Should a wild animal be destroyed for acting according to its nature, even if that nature had turned unusually violent? The debate was fierce. Some argued Bonaparte had become too dangerous and should be euthanized or relocated. Others, including Dr. Jennifer Kruger, argued that the hippo had been defending territory during a stressful drought period and that killing him would be punishing an animal for human encroachment. The lodge faced immediate scrutiny from multiple agencies. The Tourism Safety Board launched a comprehensive review of all operational procedures. Every guide route was reassessed, every safety protocol questioned. The investigation revealed that while the lodge had followed industry standards, those standards might be insufficient when dealing with animals experiencing environmental stress. The drought had created conditions that made normally safe areas unpredictable, a factor that hadn't been adequately addressed in risk assessments. Mark's funeral, held 5 days after the attack, drew over 500 mourners to the small chapel in Hoedspruit. The safari community from across southern Africa came to pay respects to one of their own. Guides who had competed with Mark for clients stood shoulder to shoulder with those he'd trained, united in grief and respect. Emma read a poem she'd written about her father, breaking down halfway through as Craig Morrison stepped up to finish it for her. James placed his father's worn field guide on the coffin, the book Mark had carried for 20 years, filled with his handwritten notes about animal behavior. Sarah's eulogy was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Mark died doing what he loved, protecting people in the place he loved most. He wouldn't want us to hate Bonaparte or fear the bush. He'd want us to learn from this, to be safer, but never to stop appreciating the wild places he devoted his life to sharing with others. Her strength in that moment, standing before hundreds while her world had shattered, exemplified the resilience of those who choose to live alongside nature's dangers. The legal ramifications began almost immediately. The families of the traumatized guests filed claims against the lodge's insurance, seeking compensation for psychological trauma. Helen, the Australian woman Mark had saved, required extensive psychiatric treatment for PTSD, experiencing recurring nightmares and panic attacks triggered by any large animal or even nature documentaries. The Japanese couple cut their honeymoon short and returned to Tokyo, where Yuki underwent months of therapy to process the trauma. Their wedding photos would forever be tainted by the horror that followed. The lodge's reputation took a severe hit. Bookings dropped by 60% in the immediate aftermath, with many guests canceling long-planned safaris. Travel forums buzzed with debates about safety, and several international tour operators temporarily suspended partnerships with the property. Peter van der Merwe worked tirelessly to salvage the business Mark had helped build, implementing new safety measures and counseling programs for both staff and guests. But the empty chairs at the breakfast table told the story of an industry shaken to its core. An unexpected controversy arose when Hans Mueller's footage leaked online. Despite the family's requests and legal attempts to block it, the video appeared on various platforms, going viral within hours. The graphic nature of the attack horrified viewers worldwide while reigniting debates about wildlife tourism safety. Sarah was devastated, knowing that her husband's brutal final moments were being viewed as entertainment by millions. "They're watching him die like it's a movie," she sobbed to reporters. "That's not how he should be remembered." The wildlife management decision regarding Bonaparte was finally made 3 weeks after the attack. After extensive debate involving conservationists, government officials, and community representatives, it was decided that Bonaparte would be relocated rather than destroyed. The operation, carried out by specialized teams, saw the massive hippo tranquilized and transported 200 kilometers to a reserve where he could claim territory without human interaction. The move was controversial. Some felt justice hadn't been served, while others praised the recognition that Bonaparte was simply a wild animal acting on instinct. In the months that followed, the Lautenbach family struggled to find their new normal. Sarah discovered that Mark had been the primary breadwinner, and while insurance provided some support, the financial pressure added to her grief. The conservation community rallied around them, establishing the Mark Lautenbach Memorial Fund to support the education of Guide's children. Emma changed her university plans, switching from wildlife management to psychology, saying she wanted to help others process trauma. James withdrew into himself, spending hours reading his father's field journals and watching old family videos. The lodge implemented sweeping changes in response to the tragedy. All river walks were suspended indefinitely, and when they resumed 6 months later, they followed routes that maintained at least 100 meters distance from water at all times. New protocols required 2 armed guides for every walking safari, and advanced radio tracking systems were installed to monitor dangerous game movements. The financial cost was enormous, but Peter van der Merwe insisted that no expense was too great if it prevented another tragedy. Dr. Jennifer Kruger published a landmark paper on hippo behavior during environmental stress, using Bonaparte's attack as a case study. Her research revealed that the combination of drought, territorial pressure, and possibly underlying health issues had created a perfect storm of aggression. She identified warning signs that had been missed and proposed new guidelines for assessing hippo behavior during adverse conditions. The paper became required reading for guides across Africa, ensuring that Mark's death would contribute to future safety. The impact on the guiding community was profound. Many experienced guides reported increased anxiety when leading walks, and several left the profession entirely. Those who remained spoke of a loss of innocence, the comfortable familiarity with dangerous game that came from years without serious incidents had been shattered. Training programs were revised to emphasize that experience could breed dangerous complacency, using Mark's story as a cautionary tale. The phrase 20 years of experience, 20 seconds to die, became a somber reminder in guide training sessions. Sarah eventually made the difficult decision to leave the lodge accommodation where she'd lived with Mark for 15 years. Every vista reminded her of him, every sunset brought back memories of their life together. She moved to Johannesburg to be closer to her family, taking a position with a conservation NGO where she could honor Mark's legacy without the daily pain of living where he died. The children visited the lodge once more to scatter some of Mark's ashes at his favorite viewpoint, a moment of closure that helped them begin healing. Dr. Richard Ferreira, a wildlife behaviorist with 35 years of experience studying African megafauna, has analyzed over 200 hippo attacks throughout his career. When he reviewed the Bonaparte incident, several factors immediately stood out as extraordinary. This wasn't a typical territorial defense. Dr. Ferreira explains from his office at the University of Pretoria. Bonaparte exhibited what we call pursuit predation behavior, something we simply don't see in hippos. He didn't just defend his space. He ambushed, pursued, and ensured termination of the perceived threat. This suggests either a neurological abnormality or an extreme stress response we've never properly documented before. Dr. Ferreira's analysis of Hans Müller's footage revealed disturbing details about Bonaparte's attack pattern. The hippo had positioned himself at a tactical advantage point, suggesting premeditation rarely seen in wildlife attacks. Look at frame 347. He points to a frozen image on his computer screen. Bonaparte's body position is completely submerged except for his eyes and nostrils. He's in full ambush mode. Hippos typically warn before attacking, they yawn, they vocalize, they mock charge. Bonaparte did none of these. He went straight for the kill, which indicates this wasn't about territory. This was about elimination. The biomechanics of the attack were studied by Dr. Angela Morrison, a veterinary pathologist specializing in large mammal anatomy. Her analysis of Mark's injuries provided crucial insights into the sheer power of a hippo attack. The bite force of an adult hippo can exceed 1,800 psi, she explains, pulling up comparative charts. To put that in perspective, a lion's bite is around 650 psi. But it's not just the pressure, it's the way hippo jaws are designed. Those tusks aren't for chewing, they're weapons. They're continuously growing, self-sharpening instruments of destruction. When Bonaparte bit down on Mr. Lautenbach, it wasn't just crushing force. Those tusks acted like 4 massive daggers, creating both penetrating and crushing injuries simultaneously. Dr. Morrison's examination of the injury patterns revealed something particularly disturbing. The initial bite was precisely placed to cause maximum damage. Whether by instinct or intent, Bonaparte's jaws closed around the victim's center mass, where vital organs are clustered. The lower tusks penetrated the abdomen and likely lacerated the liver and intestines, while the upper tusks punctured the thoracic cavity. The victim would have experienced massive internal hemorrhaging within seconds. Even if this had happened in a trauma center parking lot, survival would have been unlikely. From a psychological perspective, Dr. Sarah Hendricks, who specializes in human-wildlife conflict psychology, analyzed why Mark might have missed or dismissed warning signs. We see this phenomenon frequently with experienced professionals in high-risk fields, she notes. It's called expert's paradox. The more familiar someone becomes with danger, the more their risk assessment becomes calibrated to their personal experience rather than objective hazard levels. Mr. Lautenbach had 20 years of successful hippo encounters. His brain had created a pattern recognition system based on those safe encounters. When Bonaparte's behavior deviated from that pattern, his experienced mind might have rationalized it rather than recognizing it as a novel threat. Dr. Hendricks also examined the group dynamic that morning. The presence of tourists added complexity to Mr. Lautenbach's decision-making. Guides face constant pressure to provide memorable experiences while maintaining safety. There's also the performance aspect. Being watched by admirers can unconsciously influence even experienced professionals to take risks they might not take alone. When Mr. Lautenbach chose the lower path with better views, he was balancing multiple competing priorities. His tragic error was allowing his confidence in reading hippo behavior to override the accumulating warning signs. Legal expert Professor James Whitaker from the University of Cape Town's law faculty analyzed the liability aspects of the case. Wildlife tourism operates in a unique legal space, he explains. Participants generally sign waivers acknowledging inherent risks, but operators still maintain a duty of care. The investigation found that Olifants River Lodge followed industry standards, but this case raises questions about whether those standards are adequate. Should wildlife stress indicators be part of mandatory daily risk assessments? Should there be enforced no-go zones during environmental stress periods? These are questions the industry must grapple with. The attack's impact on policy was significant. Professor Whitaker notes that within 6 months of Mark's death, 3 provinces had updated their wildlife tourism regulations. The new requirements include mandatory environmental stress assessments, increased minimum distances from dangerous game during drought conditions, and required psychological support protocols for incident witnesses. It's tragic that it took Mr. Lautenbach's death to catalyze these changes, but his legacy is potentially saving future lives. Dr. Jennifer Kruger, whose warnings about Bonaparte had gone unheeded, provided perhaps the most comprehensive analysis. I've studied this population for 15 years, she states, visibly emotional even months later. Bonaparte's behavioral changes followed a predictable escalation, pattern that we've documented in other stressed hippo populations. The daylight grazing, the increased yawning frequency, the expansion of territorial marking, these weren't random. They were systematic indicators of an animal under extreme stress, possibly compounded by age, related cognitive changes or underlying health issues we couldn't detect without capturing him. Her research revealed that the drought had reduced Bonaparte's pool volume by 65%, concentrating waste products and reducing water quality. Hippos are surprisingly sensitive to their aquatic environment, Dr. Kruger explains. Poor water quality can cause skin irritation, infections, and chronic discomfort. Combined with reduced grazing areas and increased competition, Bonaparte was essentially in constant pain and stress. Doesn't excuse the attack, but it explains the mechanism. He wasn't a rogue hippo in the traditional sense, he was an animal pushed beyond his psychological breaking point. The veterinary analysis of Bonaparte post-relocation provided additional insights. Dr. André Ferry, who had tranquilized Bonaparte during the recovery operation, later conducted a full health assessment. We found several issues that could have contributed to his aggression, he reports. Severe dental problems in his lower left tusk were causing chronic pain. He had early-stage kidney disease, likely from years of concentrated waste exposure during droughts. Most significantly, we found scarring in his brain tissue consistent with previous trauma, possibly from fights with other bulls. Any of these factors alone could increase aggression. Together, they created a neurologically compromised animal with reduced impulse control. Comparative analysis with other fatal hippo attacks revealed Bonaparte's case as unique. Dr. Michael Chen, who maintains the International Database of Wildlife Attacks, found no similar cases of hippo ambush behavior. In 97% of fatal hippo encounters, the victim accidentally came between the hippo and water or surprised the animal while it was grazing. Clear territorial defense. Bonaparte's attack breaks all patterns. His territory to establish an ambush position. He waited. He attacked without warning. This suggests either learned behavior or significant neurological abnormality. The implications for safety protocols are profound. If hippos can develop hunting-like behaviors under stress, our entire risk assessment model needs revision. Marine biologist Dr. Patricia Ogilvie, brought in to analyze the river ecosystem, discovered additional environmental factors. The Olifants River has seen dramatic changes over the past decade, she explains. Agricultural runoff has increased nitrogen levels by 300%, causing algae blooms that further degrade water quality. Microplastic pollution is at record levels. Fish populations that hippos rely on for cleaning parasites have declined by 70%. We're creating perfect conditions for wildlife psychological distress, then acting surprised when animals behave abnormally. The human factors analysis conducted by aviation safety expert Captain Robert Taylor, brought in for his expertise in crisis decision-making, highlighted systematic issues. In aviation, we recognize that accidents rarely have single causes. They're typically the result of multiple small failures aligning. The same applies here. Mr. Lautenbach made a series of minor compromises, choosing the scenic route, dismissing behavioral changes, pushing through despite environmental warnings. None of these decisions alone was fatal, but together, they created what we call an error chain. Breaking any link in that chain could have prevented the tragedy. Primate researcher Dr. Jane Melotto offered a unique perspective on the evolutionary aspects. Hippos and humans have coexisted for millennia. She notes, traditional communities developed elaborate protocols for sharing water resources safely. Modern tourism has disrupted these patterns. We've created artificial situations where humans regularly invade hippo space for entertainment. From an evolutionary perspective, remarkable attacks aren't more common. Bonaparte's extreme response might represent an adaptation attempt, eliminating threats rather than just deterring them. If this behavior spreads, it could signal a fundamental shift in human-wildlife dynamics. Mark Lautenbach's tragedy teaches us that 20 years of experience in the wild can create a dangerous illusion of mastery over forces that remain fundamentally untamable. He was a gifted guide, a devoted family man, and a true conservationist, but his extensive knowledge became a double-edged sword that may have dulled his perception of novel dangers. His story serves as a stark reminder that in nature's domain, expertise must always be tempered with humility and the recognition that wild animals are not characters in our narrative, they are unpredictable beings capable of behaviors that defy our carefully constructed understanding. The warning signs were there, written in Bonaparte's changing behaviors like a language Mark had spent 2 decades learning to read, yet somehow missed in translation when it mattered most. The daylight grazing that should have screamed danger. The territorial expansions that indicated a hippo pushed beyond normal stress responses. The escalating aggression that Dr. Kruger had desperately tried to highlight. Sign alone might have been dismissible, but together they painted a portrait of an animal in crisis, ready to explode with unprecedented violence. Saw these signs through the lens of his past experiences rather than recognizing them as harbingers of something entirely new. For those who work in wildlife tourism, Mark's death has become a watershed moment that fundamentally changed how guides approach their craft. No longer can experience be worn as armor against the wild's unpredictability. Training programs now emphasize what they call dynamic risk assessment, the constant reevaluation of animal behavior without the bias of previous safe encounters. Guides are taught to treat every interaction as potentially their first, to never allow familiarity to breed complacency. The mantra, respect through distance, has replaced the old confidence of reading animal moods. The specific lessons regarding hippo behavior have revolutionized safety protocols across Africa. We now know that environmental stressors can fundamentally alter hippo psychology, transforming them from predictable territorial defenders into something far more dangerous. The new guidelines mandate minimum distances of 100 meters from any water body during walking safaris, increasing to 200 meters during drought conditions. No exceptions, no matter how well guides think they know individual animals. Bonaparte taught us that a stressed hippo isn't just more aggressive, it can become tactically intelligent in its violence. Mark's legacy lives on in ways both tangible and profound. The Mark Lautenbach Wildlife Guide Training Center, established with funds raised by the conservation community, has already graduated its first class of guides trained under the new safety protocols his death inspired. Young men and women carry forward his passion for sharing Africa's wild places, but with a heightened awareness of the responsibility that comes with leading others into danger. Emma Lautenbach, now pursuing her psychology degree, plans to specialize in trauma counseling for wildlife attack survivors, turning her father's tragedy into a mission to help others heal. The changes implemented at Olifants River Lodge have become industry standards. The dual guide system for walking safaris, initially seen as excessive, is now recognized as essential. The investment in environmental monitoring equipment allows real-time tracking of water quality, temperature, and other stress indicators. When certain thresholds are reached, activities are automatically restricted. Peter van der Merwe often says that Mark would have initially resisted these changes as unnecessary, but would have ultimately embraced anything that kept people safer. Sarah Lautenbach has become an unexpected advocate for balanced wildlife conservation. Speaking at conferences and to tourist groups, she shares Mark's story not to frighten people away from nature, but to inspire proper respect for it. Mark wouldn't want anyone to fear the bush. Because of what happened to him, she tells audiences, her voice steady despite the pain that never fully fades. He'd want you to love it like he did, but to love it with your eyes open to its dangers. The wild places of this world are treasures, but they're not playgrounds. Respect that and you honor his memory. The scientific community has gained invaluable insights from studying Bonaparte's case. The research has led to new understanding of how Environmental degradation affects megafauna psychology, spurring conservation efforts focused not just on preserving habitat, but on maintaining habitat quality. Water management programs now consider hippopotamus psychological health as a key indicator of ecosystem stability. Bonaparte himself, relocated to a stress-free environment, has shown no signs of unusual aggression, supporting theories that his violence was situationally induced rather than inherent. For the tourism industry, Mark's death catalyzed long-overdue conversations about the ethics of wildlife viewing. The push for ever closer encounters, driven by social media's insatiable appetite for spectacular content, has been recognized as unsustainable and dangerous. Marketing emphasizes respectful observation over proximity, with lodges competing on safety records rather than just sighting guarantees. The phrase ethical distance has entered the lexicon, representing a fundamental shift in how wildlife tourism presents itself. The psychological impact on witnesses has led to improved support systems for trauma in remote locations. The lodge now maintains a partnership with mental health professionals who specialize in wildlife-related PTSD. Guides receive training not just in preventing attacks, but in managing the psychological aftermath should tragedy strike. Hans Mueller, who still struggles with having filmed Mark's death, has become an advocate for witness support, sharing his journey through therapy to help others understand that surviving such trauma requires professional help. Legal frameworks have evolved significantly in response to the incident. Wildlife tourism insurance now requires comprehensive environmental stress assessments, and operators must demonstrate adaptive protocols that respond to changing conditions. The standard waiver forms have been rewritten to ensure tourists truly understand that wild means unpredictable, that no amount of expertise can guarantee safety. Some argue these changes have made wildlife tourism less accessible, but most agree that honest risk communication serves everyone better than false confidence. The conservation message that emerges from Mark's story is complex but crucial. Human-wildlife conflict isn't just about animals invading human spaces, it's equally about humans persistently entering wildlife domains with insufficient respect for the stress we cause. The drought that contributed to Bonaparte's condition was exacerbated by upstream water management favoring agriculture over ecosystem health. Mark's death, while immediately caused by a hippo's jaws, was ultimately the result of human decisions that created impossible conditions for wildlife. Young James Lautenbach, now 15, recently gave his first presentation about hippo behavior at his school's science fair. Using his father's journals and modern research, he explained how climate change and habitat pressure are creating more situations like the one that killed his father. Dad always said the animals were perfect as they were, James told his audience. But we're changing their world so fast they can't be perfect anymore. They can only survive, and sometimes survival looks like violence. If we want to keep sharing the world with amazing animals like hippos, we need to give them the space and conditions to be themselves safely. The morning river walks have resumed at Olifants River Lodge, but they're different now. Guides speak in hushed tones when they pass the memorial plaque marking where Mark fell. They point out hippos from respectful distances, explaining not just their behavior but the delicate balance required for coexistence. Tourists often ask about the attack, and guides answer honestly, yes, a man died here, killed by an animal he thought he knew. But he died protecting others, and his death taught us lessons that keep everyone safer today. As we reflect on Mark Lautenbach's story, we must resist the urge to cast it as a simple tale of man versus nature. It's a story about the price of complacency, the danger of expertise without humility, and the tragic consequences when human pressure pushes wildlife beyond their breaking point. It's about a good man who made an understandable error in judgment and paid the ultimate price. Most importantly, it's about learning from tragedy to prevent its repetition. Share this story not for shock value, but for education. When you next visit wild places, remember Mark Lautenbach, not just how he died, but how he lived. Remember his passion for wildlife, his dedication to conservation, and his belief that humans and animals could coexist with mutual Respect. Honor his memory by maintaining that respect, by never allowing familiarity to overcome caution, by supporting conservation efforts that address not just animal populations but their quality of life. If you found value in understanding this tragedy and its lessons, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses of human-wildlife interactions. We don't sensationalize these stories. We study them, learn from them, and share those lessons to create a safer world for both humans and wildlife. Hit the notification bell to stay informed about conservation issues, safety protocols, and the ongoing work to prevent tragedies like Mark's. Remember, in the wild there are no guarantees, no absolute safety, no complete predictability. Mark Lautenbach knew this intellectually but perhaps forgot it emotionally in his final moments. Don't make the same mistake. Respect the wild, maintain your distance, and never forget that the most beautiful things in nature are often the most dangerous. Mark would want his story to inspire caution without fear, respect without retreat, and above all, a continued love for the wild places he died protecting. His final words, whispered to Hans Müller as his life ebbed away, were about his wife Sarah. But his final actions spoke louder, stepping between danger and the people he was sworn to protect. That's how Mark Lautenbach should be remembered, not as a victim of the wild he loved, but as its guardian until the very end. May his story save lives, inspire respect, and remind us always that in nature's kingdom we are only visitors, forever at the mercy of forces greater than our understanding.